Welcome to Hood Politics. In this episode, I will be discussing the war between the Black P. Stone Bloods and the Rollin 30's Harlem Crips and the Rollin 40's neighborhood Crips. The facts of the case are as follows. The West Side Black P. Stone Bloods have a unique history when it comes to Los Angeles gangs. The Black P. Stones were founded in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois in the late 1950s under the name Blackstone Rangers by Jeff Fort and Eugene Hairston and got their name from Blackstone Avenue. The Blackstones quickly became one of the city's most reputable gangs. As they grew in size, they began to take over other neighborhoods and absorb other groups. Jeff Fort wanted to organize the Blackstones and make them a more socially conscious and black nationalistic group. So in the 1960s, he renamed the group to the Black P. Stones. Amongst the ranks of the Black P. Stones was a young man named T. Rogers. T. Rogers moved to the west side of Los Angeles, and with the permission of Black P. Stone leaders, T. Rogers was given the green light to start the Black P. Stones in a Los Angeles neighborhood that would later be referred to as the City, and the group would later be referred to as the City Stones. The City Stones would later go on to form many cliques, including 21st Street, which is where the Stones initially formed, 25th Street, 28th Street, and others. You'll often see City Stones use the number 2158, which is a combination of the cliques. A short time afterwards, the City Stones would align themselves with a nearby group known as the Jungle Boys. The Jungle Boys were from a neighborhood known as Baldwin Village, which was nicknamed the Jungles due to the large amount of plant life in the neighborhood. The Jungle Boys would go on to adopt the Black P. Stone identity and would later be referred to as the Jungle Stones. During these years, the Los Angeles Black P. Stones would become rivals to the Crips, and they would go on to play an important role in the formation of the Blood Alliance during the early 1970s. Although the Los Angeles Black P. Stones are Bloods, you'll often hear them refer to the number 5 or hear them say all is well and Stone Love, which are terms originated by the Chicago Black P. Stones. The Rollin 30's Harlem Crips formed in 1969 or 1970 under the leadership of a man named James Miller. In the early 1970s, the West Side Crips approached James and suggested they become Crips. James agreed, and the gang became the Harlem Crips. They later added the Rollin 30's to their name. There was a short period of time that they went by the Godfathers, but they would drop the Godfather identity in the early 1970s. There has been a debate regarding where the Harlem name came from. Some say James Miller was originally from Harlem, New York, but that rumor has been debunked. Others say it's because Harlem was the epitome of style, music, and black culture at the time. But no theory has been validated, and much of the first-hand knowledge has been lost. The Rollin 30's have numerous cliques, including the Avenues, Dinker Park, 35th Street, 37th Street, 39th Street, and others. The Rollin 40's neighborhood Crips formed in the early 1980s. Initially, there were a handful of smaller gangs occupying this territory, but some of the groups held a meeting at 42nd Street Elementary School, formed an alliance, and decided to become one, the Rollin 40's neighborhood Crips. Early on, the Rollin 30's wanted the Rollin 40's to become Rollin 40's Harlem Crips, but the 40's chose to maintain their own identity. The Rollin 40's have 4 main cliques: the Avenues, Western Side, the Park Side, and the Dark Side. The Black P. Stones are bitter rivals of the Rollin 30's Harlem Crips and the Rollin 40's neighborhood Crips. In one incident, on July 26, 2006 at 6 p.m., a young man named Kevin Flowers was walking with his friend, Jeremy Deshone, on Jefferson Boulevard. Kevin and Jeremy were members of the Rollin 30's Harlem Crips. The two were walking to a nearby liquor store when a white Impala drove past them. Kevin was on edge because the people inside of the Impala gave them a dirty look. A few moments later, the Impala returned and someone in the vehicle opened fire. Jeremy was struck in the foot, and Kevin was struck in his side and in his foot. Kevin was left paralyzed from the waist down as a result of the shooting. Both young men initially denied seeing the shooter. A detective named Corey Farrell interviewed Kevin about the shooting. Kevin again denied knowing who the shooter was, but when Farrell put his notes away, Kevin identified the shooter as a 15-year-old young man named Theodore Snyder, who he knew as Teddy. Kevin had attended Dorsey High School with Teddy and had an altercation with him the previous school year. Later that evening, Farrell provided Kevin with the photographic lineup and asked him to identify the shooter. Kevin picked Teddy's picture. Farrell visited Kevin a second time a few weeks later. Kevin reiterated that he was 100% sure that the person he identified was the shooter. He went on to say that Teddy was a Blood gang member and had made references to the gang during their fight at Dorsey High. During the second interview, Kevin expressed reluctance to appear in court, stating that if he testified, he could end up dead, and that he in fact knew someone who was killed for testifying. Kevin went on to say that his mom took care of his younger sister by herself and he didn't want to create any problems for them. Farrell also interviewed Jeremy about the shooting, but he denied seeing the shooter. Farrell paid Jeremy another visit in February of 2007. This time, Jeremy was in custody on an unrelated charge and decided to speak to Farrell. He also identified Teddy as the shooter and told Farrell that Teddy lived in the jungles. In 2006, a woman named Lorenzia lived in the area and had a brother who was a Black P. Stone member. She also dated a Black P. Stone member named Brandon. Lorenzia saw Brandon and Teddy hang out on August Street, and on July 26, the evening of the shooting, she allowed Brandon to use her rental car. The car was similar to the one used in the shooting. Also on July 26, an LAPD sergeant named Asiter McCurchian observed a white Impala driving down the street and turning north on Arlington Avenue. McCurchian wrote the plate down because the 3 African-American males inside of the car appeared to be excited. Shortly afterwards, McCurchian received a radio broadcast regarding the shooting. The vehicle was described as a white Impala, so he provided the license plate number to detectives. A few days later, McCurchian picked Brandon out of a photographic lineup and identified him as the driver of the Impala. On July 31st, officers pulled over Brandon while he was driving the white Impala and were able to match the license plate number to the vehicle. Theodore Snyder was charged with 2 counts of premeditated attempted murder for the shootings of Kevin Flowers and Jeremy Deshawn, as well as gun and gang enhancement charges. He later pled not guilty. During the trial, Kevin and Jeremy were reluctant to testify. Officers found Kevin hiding in a bedroom closet, and Jeremy had missed numerous proceedings and was held in custody as a material witness as a result. Neither Kevin or Jeremy identified Teddy as the shooter during the trial, but their statements to police were taken into account and presented to the jury. Investigators also told the court about the no snitching rule and explained that Kevin and Jeremy were in fear for their lives. The gang expert for the case told the court about the rivalry between the Black P. Stones and the Rollin 30's, and how the Black P. Stone members would gain status within the gang by venturing into rival Rollin 30's territory and committing a drive-by shooting. Theodore Snyder was found guilty with the attempted murders of Kevin Flowers and Jeremy Deshawn, as well as gun and gang enhancement charges. In the time between the verdict phase and the sentencing phase, Teddy became a case study for over-sentencing juvenile offenders. Teddy was expected to be sentenced to 80 years to life in prison. An organization called the Youth Justice Coalition criticized the potential 80-year sentence. They cited a Supreme Court ruling that stated juveniles who didn't kill anyone can't be sentenced to life without parole, but an 80-year sentence was essentially a life sentence. Ultimately, Theodore Snyder was sentenced to 32 years in prison. In another incident, on February 7, 2010, at around 3 a.m., members of the Rollin 30's were attending a party. Amongst the partygoers were Charles Allen, Antonio Burden, Brandon Maxwell, and a woman named Ashia Ali, who went by the nickname BK Barbie. A few moments later, a Black P. Stone member showed up at the party and opened fire, striking a Rollin 30's member named Lil Shady Boy. Shortly afterwards, Charles, Antonio, Brandon, and Ashia piled into a Chevy Traverse SUV and went looking for revenge. Charles was the driver. The group was armed as they drove through Blood territory, looking for rivals. Shortly before 4:30 a.m., the group spotted a man named Darnell Jackson walking down the street, along with his friend, Jeremy Owens. As Darnell and Jeremy walked over an overpass, they saw an SUV coming from the opposite direction. Someone in the SUV said, "What's up? Where y'all from?" and flashed gang signs. The SUV then drove past Darnell and Jeremy, drove into an alley, and disappeared. Darnell and Jeremy continued walking into a dead-end street when Antonio, Brandon, and Nashia approached them on foot. They began asking Darnell and Jeremy about their gang affiliations. Both men denied any gang affiliations, and Darnell began showing the group his tattoos while saying he didn't bang. The group talked amongst themselves for a few moments. A few seconds later, one of the men spun around and shot Darnell in the back of the head. When Jeremy ran, they all opened fire on him. The shooters then fled the scene. When the smoke cleared, Jeremy was struck in the forehead, but he survived. Darnell was transported to a hospital. At 5 a.m., Darnell was pronounced dead. Darnell was wearing red clothing, red shoes, and a red St. Louis Cardinals hat, a color and hat favored by the Black P. Stones, with the STL meaning Stone Love. Jeremy later testified that he believed Darnell had been a Blood. After speaking to witnesses, investigators gathered a list of their prime suspects. Among the list was Charles. Investigators questioned Charles about the party and the murder, but Charles denied being at the party and said he knew nothing about the murder. At the time of the shooting, Charles was wearing an ankle monitor. Investigators confronted Charles with the GPS tracking information and showed him that it placed him at the party and near the scene of the shooting. Investigators went on to tell Charles that someone was talking to them about the shooting and showed him a picture of Ashia. Charles replied that he was just driving around that night, headed to the beach. In a recorded call from jail that afternoon, Charles told a woman they know everything. In another recorded call that evening, Charles spoke to Brandon. Brandon asked, "I could do what I do on the Barbie?" Charles replied, "All day, cuz it's on my lead." Brandon responded, "Say no more." A gang expert later told the court that this coded conversation was Charles giving Brandon the green light to kill Ashia due to him believing she was cooperating with investigators. A man named Gene Palacios testified against Charles in exchange for leniency in an unrelated case. Gene told the court that Charles showed up at his house in a Chevy Traverse around 11 a.m., a few hours after the shooting. Gene said Charles told him some Bloods had shot up their party, so he, Antonio, Brandon, and Ashia went to do their stuff in BPS Hood. Charles went on to say that they spotted two people crossing the bridge over the 10 freeway and followed them. One of the guys had on red Chucks. Charles stated that he parked on the back street and Antonio, Brandon, and Ashia jumped out of the car and approached the guys on foot. All three had guns. Ultimately, Charles Allen was found guilty with the murder of Darnell Jackson and the attempted murder of Jeremy Owens, as well as gun and gang enhancement charges. Charles Allen was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. It's unclear what Antonio Burton, Brandon Maxwell, and Ashia Ali received for their roles in the shooting, and that could be for a multitude of reasons. They could have taken plea deals or had their charges downgraded or dismissed, among other things. In another incident, on July 5th, 2010, at around 3:30 a.m., a man named Keith Campbell pulled into a Valero gas station at the intersection of Western and Vernon Avenues. The gas station was in Rollin 40's Crip territory. Keith's cousin Chad Andrew was riding in the front passenger seat. Keith exited the vehicle and began walking to the station's cashier window, while Chad remained in the car. As Keith approached the window, he noticed two men wearing red approaching him. They asked Keith, "Where you from?" Keith ran back towards the BMW and shouted to Chad to get out of the car and run away. Keith entered the car's back seat as Chad exited the vehicle. The two men then opened fire on the BMW. Keith was shot twice, once in the chest and once in the shoulder. Chad managed to get out the car, but was shot multiple times. The shooters then fled the scene. Keith called 911 on his cell phone, and when officers arrived, they found the BMW at the gas pump with a shattered window. A few feet away, they found Chad laying on the ground. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives arrived at the scene and began their investigation. Investigators found 22 9mm bullet casings. They also discovered live rounds, 2 bullet casings, and a bullet fragment inside of the BMW. A police criminalist later reviewed all of the firearms evidence and concluded that at least 3 guns were used and multiple shots were fired from inside of the BMW. Keith later told the court that he didn't have a gun and he didn't shoot back at the man who fired at Chad and him. Around 40 minutes after the shooting, 4 men entered the emergency room at the Harbor UCLA Medical Center. All of the men were wearing red and one of them was wounded. 3 of the men left the wounded man in the emergency room and fled to a gray Chevy Malibu. A sheriff's dispatcher at the hospital radioed the license plate number, a description of the vehicle, and a description of the men. A sheriff's deputy stopped the Malibu and observed the passenger placing something into the center console. The men were detained and identified themselves as Dontrell Williams, Irving Holloway, and Malik Birdsong. Dontrell told the deputies that he was a member of the Black P-Stones. During a search of the vehicle, a revolver was found in the center console area. The man left in the emergency room was identified as Arturo Collins. Arturo was treated for a through-and-through gunshot wound to his left thigh and was released the same morning. Investigators reviewed the footage from the gas station surveillance camera and noticed that one of the shooters was struck in the left thigh. Investigators also used a nearby cell phone tower to place Arturo at the scene during the time of the shooting. Arturo Collins was charged with murder for the death of Chad Andrew and attempted murder for the shooting of Keith Campbell, as well as gun and gang enhancement charges. He later pled not guilty. During the trial, the surveillance tape was played for the jury. It showed the shooter seemingly being hit in the same area that Arturo was. A custodian of records at Metro PCS testified about cell phone calls at the gas station. He authenticated records for a prepaid cell phone registered to Arturo Collins. On July 5th, around the time of the shooting, the phone received an incoming call. The call transmitted on a tower about 120 feet from the gas station. The gang expert for the case was an officer named Phil Rodriguez. Rodriguez testified that he was familiar with the Black P-Stones and had arrested members and served members injunction notices in the past, and he had testified in more than 80 gang cases involving the Black P-Stones. Rodriguez was familiar with Arturo, who he knew as Poppy. Rodriguez told the court about Arturo's gang tattoos and showed gang photos that he was featured in. Rodriguez was was also familiar with the men that took Arturo to the hospital. He knew Michael as Lil Poppy, Dontrell as Nook, and Irving as T-Roll. Rodriguez went on to say that the shooting was done in benefit of the Black P. Stones. Ultimately, Arturo Collins was found guilty with the murder of Chad Andrew and the attempted murder of Keith Campbell, as well as gun and gang enhancement charges. Arturo Collins was sentenced to life in prison. In another incident, on the night of October 31st, 2012, the Black Student Assembly at the University of Southern California sponsored a Halloween party titled Freak or Greek at the Ronald Tudor Campus Center. By all accounts, the night was going well. Word of the party has spread throughout the campus and the surrounding neighborhoods, and there were hundreds of people in line waiting to enter the party, but things would take a turn for the worse. Around 11:30 p.m., partygoers heard an argument taking place at the back of the line, and moments later, gunfire erupted. The campus was in chaos as the partygoers fled and dug for cover. When the smoke cleared, 4 people were discovered shot: Devontae Smith, Thomas Ritchie, Myson Downs, and Gino Hall, all of whom went on to survive. A USC security officer gave police a description of the shooter. Shortly afterwards, LAPD saw a man matching the description walking in the campus parking lot, half a mile away from the scene of the shooting. The man had taken off his shirt. Officers stopped the man and identified him as a 19-year-old man named Brandon Spencer. Brandon was taken into custody for questioning. Officers seized Brandon's phone and searched it. On the phone, they discovered a photo of a revolver, a photo of Brandon firing a gun at an indoor gun range, a photo of Black P. Stone graffiti, and a video of Brandon and other gang members driving around asking people where they were from, meaning what gang did they claim. Brandon was a member of the Black P. Stones and went by the nickname Bleep. He was transported to the police department and questioned about the shooting. Brandon said he was in line for the party with his girlfriend when they heard the gunshots and ran. The USC security guard later identified Brandon out of the possible suspects. 3 hours after the shooting, a black .38 caliber revolver, which was believed to be the one used during the shooting, was recovered, but Brandon's fingerprints weren't on the weapon and DNA was inconclusive. Investigators also spoke to the victims. Devontae, Thomas, and Myson all denied knowing who the shooter was, but Gino's alleged statements to officers became the subject of debate amongst gang members. Rival gang members produced a transcript, which showed Gino giving information to officers, including naming Brandon as the shooter and mentioning a feud on Twitter that they were engaged in. Others doubted the authenticity of the transcript and felt it was created by a rival to make Gino and the Rollin 40's look like snitches. After speaking to witnesses and viewing the photos and video that were discovered on Brandon's phone, investigators believe the shooting was gang-related. Gino was a former star football player at Crenshaw High School, but he was also a well-known member of the Rollin 40's Crips, and when investigators discovered that Brandon and Gino were actively feuding on Twitter, it confirmed their belief even more. About a year prior to the incident at USC, Brandon was shot in the stomach while attending a party at the Proud Bird Event Center near the LAX airport. Brandon believed the Rollin 40's were responsible, and according to investigators, that incident sent them on a warpath against them. Brandon Spencer was charged with 4 counts of premeditated attempted murder for the shootings of Devontae Smith, Thomas Ritchie, Myson Downs, and Gino Hall, as well as gun and gang enhancement charges. He later pled not guilty. During the trial, the prosecutor painted Brandon as an active member of the Black P. Stones and showed the jury gang photos and video as evidence. Brandon also has a BS tattoo on his chest. Prosecutors told the court that it stood for Blackstone. The prosecutor cited Brandon taking off his shirt after the shooting as an attempt to change his description. Prosecutors also cited Brandon and Gino's Twitter pages as evidence of their rivalry. In one post, Brandon mentioned Gino and tweeted, "Ain't worried about a Twitter thug named Gino," and proceeded to disrespect Gino's daughter. And in another post, he mentioned Gino again and tweeted, "First trip back to Cali, I'ma pull up 49th once again. Don't call the police either like last time." A witness testified seeing Brandon leave, return to the area with a gun, and open fire on the group. The USC security officer testified that he witnessed Brandon pull the gun from his waistband. The defense stated that all evidence against Brandon was just hearsay, and there was no actual physical evidence against him. Brandon said that he removed his shirt after the shooting because he feared it could make him a target of the actual shooter. Gino took the stand and testified that he didn't know who shot him, and he never had a Twitter feud with anyone. The other shooting victims also testified that they didn't know who shot them. The defense reiterated that no weapon had been tied to Brandon. The defense told the court that those pictures and videos were old, and after Brandon was shot, he decided to change his life. He was so so inspired by the emergency workers that saved him that he decided to become a nurse and had registered for the UCLA EMT program. Brandon was working a security job, and him being at the range would aid his performance as a security officer in a dangerous situation. The defense told the court that Brandon's BS tattoo stood for Brandon Spencer. He went on to explain that the Twitter feud with Gino wasn't serious and that the exchanges contained no threats of violence. Ultimately, Brandon Spencer was found guilty with the attempted murders of Devontae Smith, Thomas Ritchie, Myson Downs, and Gino Hall, as well as gun and gang enhancement charges. Brandon Spencer was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison.
21-year-old Brandon Spencer of Inglewood bangs his head as a judge sentences him to 40 years to life after he was convicted of shooting a rival gang member at a 2012 Halloween party on the USC campus. Today, in LA Superior Court, Spencer begged for mercy from Judge Edmund Clark Jr. before sentencing.
I'm sorry for what happened, Your Honor, but I need some life in prison. And I'm not a bad person, but I made mistakes. But I'm not just some gangbanger that she tried to portray me as.
During sentencing, Spencer completely broke down.
The minimum period of parole eligibility is 15 years plus 25 years to life in accordance with Penal Code Section 12022.53D. This is to be concurrent with.
Many feel like Brandon was railroaded in this case and feel the district attorney's office worked with the LAPD and USC to make an example out of him. USC is surrounded by numerous gang territories, and its campus and students aren't exempt from the violence that takes place in these communities. On April 11, 2012, 2 USC graduate students were shot and killed in an attempted robbery as they sat in a vehicle a few blocks west of USC's campus. Ming Ku and Ying Wu were Chinese nationals that had come to America to pursue an education. Two men, Javier Bolden and Brian Barnes, were later arrested and charged with their murders. Brian pled guilty in order to escape the death penalty and was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Javier took his case to trial, where he was found guilty and was also sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Javier and Brian were also held responsible for a shooting at a party a few months prior that left a person brain dead. On July 24, 2014, at around 12:45 a.m., a 24-year-old man named Shenron Ji was walking home from a study session when a group approached him and attempted to rob him. Shenron was hit with the wrench and the baseball bat multiple times as he ran away. Shenron made it back to his apartment, where his roommate found him dead later that morning. Investigators discovered a trail of blood leading to Shenron's apartment. The attackers, Alejandro Guerrero, Alberto Ochoa, and Andrew Garcia, were all given life sentences, while the getaway driver, Jonathan Del Carmen, was sentenced to time served. The group had also traveled to a nearby beach and attempted to rob a couple shortly after the attack on Shenron. On March 10, 2019, around 12:30 a.m., a 21-year-old man named Victor McElhaney and a group of friends walked from a nearby home to a liquor store located at the intersection of Maple Avenue and Adams Boulevard. After leaving the store, the group was approached in the parking lot by 3 or 4 men. The men attempted to rob the group and shot Victor in the process. Victor was transported to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead a few hours later. Victor had transferred from Cal State East Bay to USC in 2017 to study music. The liquor store was located about 1.5 miles east of USC's campus in Ghetto Boys gang territory. A 23-year-old member of the Ghetto Boys named Ivan Hernandez was later arrested and charged with Victor's murder. In July of 2021, Gino Hall passed away due to health complications. These have been just a few of the incidents that have taken place between the Black P-Stone Bloods and the Rollin 30's Harlem Crips and the Rollin 40's neighborhood Crips. These wars are some of the worst in the city of Los Angeles and show no signs of slowing down. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe.